to how to tackle those problems and all. So that's why.
Sorry, Ikra, what program are you from?
I am economics major, junior. Yeah.
Okay, great. Right. So anyone remembers what we studied last week?
Biosphere?
Biosphere, yeah. And I also told you that these 4 environmental spheres that we will be discussing in the next 3-4 lectures, they are all related to each other. They're all dependent upon each other. And then within those spheres, there's a lot that's happening as well. What I did not do in the biosphere lecture was I only tried to teach you more of the natural environment. And we did not speak a lot about the human influence on the natural environment or the biosphere. That includes the sphere where life is thriving. But in this particular lecture, because I think I had some room to discuss the human influence on this sphere, which hydro means water, so all the spheres that contain water would be a part of the hydrosphere. And today I am kind of focusing more on the impact that the human has created on this, using examples from history as well as recent times, and then maybe your own personal real life examples can be a part of this as well. But we care for water because we need it for our life. It's essential for us. And then there are various sources such as surface, ground, and then you can extract water from the ocean. You can reclaim water from wastewater. And then water cycle has a major role to play with it. But we as human beings pollute it a lot. And that's what we'll be looking at within all of these sub sources of water that are important for our survival. Because in all the previous lectures, we kind of studied, and this is not directly related to the lecture, but I want, again, it's something for you to think about. We studied ecological footprints, and we said that the kind of lives we live, it could lead for a huger footprint on the environment, and it would require for us to have multiple planets rather than one, more Earth rather than one Earth. Similarly, how much water you use for your survival, directly or indirectly, is a part of your water footprint. Now, of course, someone who's studying management or economics would use various formulas and equations and more complicated ways to find it out. But for us, for day-to-day lives, we can just see how much water we're using in our everyday activity, and also how much water is being used in anything that you're bringing from outside. So not just the food, the water that you put in your food, but the water that was used to grow the food that you're eating. And that water, which is not physically there and is coming in the form of wheat or is coming in the form of fruit, is actually your virtual water because you're consuming it indirectly. Whereas the water that, or you're transporting it from a certain place to your table. Whereas the water, for example, that cup of tea that you're having is your footprint. And then your overall footprint would include that cup of water, as well as the water that was used to grow the coffee or the tea, and the water that was used to transport it from a certain place to your household. And this slide, I will not spend a lot of time here, but I just want you to, when you're done with this lecture, look around your room and see all the things that you have. And then imagine how much water you are consuming and what must your footprint be. Sorry, I also have to let people in because I put them in the waiting room this time. Okay. So that's like the very basic concept. People who have their mics turned on, please put them on mute. And why is water so important? Most of the health discussions that happen are always with reference to water and waterborne diseases. For example, one of the WHO studies says that nearly 4,000 kids under the age of 5 die because of waterborne diseases. So even from the health perspective, water plays such an important part. Yes, it is abundant on our planet, but a lot of issues, it always stands at the center of a lot of issues. And those issues could be economical, there could be health issues, or they could be security issues as well. So when water is being transmitted or water is being sent from one border to the other, there could be an issue of security where, for example, one country could put a pathogen into the water and send it to the next country. One country could completely shut down the water reservoir and not allow it to go to the next country. And that country would have to compromise on its economical value that they used to derive from the water that's coming in. So not only is it an economic and global health issue, it also becomes a global security issue as well, which we often see, like every time there's more rain, you see always on TV, you would see the discussion that India has opened all the channels, or India is putting more water towards Pakistan, and that's a security problem then. Security problem in a sense that people who are living there downstream, or people who are living in the riparian areas right next to the water bodies, they're going to be massively affected by this. And then the country needs to take care of any issues that emerge as a result of this. And then environmental issue, of course, if you over extract it, if you're using it too much, if you're polluting it, then not only do you affect the human health, but you also impact the health of the world, or the health of the environment or biodiversity that resides in it. But if water is so abundant, if water is technically a blue planet, if all you see with the help of satellites is a blue globe, then why must we worry about the availability of water? There are two major things. Firstly, that most of the water that's available is in non-usable form. Non-usable, it's not suitable for us to consume it, right? And it majorly lies in the ocean, and the little water that we can consume or is suitable for our consumption is only 2.5% of the total water that's present on the planet. And we say roughly 70% of the planet is covered with water. And out of that 70%, most of it is oceans, and only 2.5% is the fresh water that's available for us to consume. And within that fresh water, not all of us is just standing there for us, right? We know it's not evenly distributed. We know it's not always in an available form. Most of it lies underground. Most of it lies in the ice caps, in the snows. And therefore, the surface water is actually a very small percentage. And even that surface water could have ice and snow cap, as well as lakes, and water that's contained in your biosphere. By that, what I mean is even your cell and even your body is water. So if people speak with you, they would often say that your body is 60% water, and a young baby's body is almost 75% water. Your brain is mostly water. So everything is water, your biology, which then comes into the category of biological water. So rivers, or the general fresh water or the ice and snow, they make a very small percentage. And like I said, they're not evenly distributed. And that's why we care about the fresh water. And that's why we say that if there are any wars, all of those security discussions that we have around water is for the fact that people who have bigger freshwater reservoirs are happy and happening, in a sense that their economy is booming and boosting. Now, one term that's often confused with hydrosphere is the cryosphere. Cryosphere just refers to that part of the hydrosphere which is in the frozen form, and it's not present in the in a water form. So people generally put a hydrosphere/cryosphere for people to understand exactly what they're talking about. And like I said, all of the water that we have, we say that roughly 99% of it is not usable, or is in a form that is unusable in the first phase. And then the water that's available, almost all of it is underground water reservoirs, or very big reservoirs, groundwater reservoirs that we call aquifers, which is like another water body under the ground that has its own way of traveling or retaining itself under the ground. And then water makes a very small percentage of it. Lakes make a relatively bigger percentage, but not all lakes are suitable for human consumption. And we'll speak about this later as well. But generally, if you are someone who's living in the city, you divide your water between the groundwater and the surface water. Right? And surface water is that water which is coming, flowing over the ground. Anything that's infiltrating into the ground is becoming a part of the groundwater is not surface water. Surface water only refers to the water that's on the surface or in the unsaturated zone of the earth, or as water vapors in your atmosphere. So and within that ground, you have the unsaturated zone where because of gravity, the water is going down. Then it goes to a relatively saturated zone. And then past that is the water reservoir that I was talking about, which is aquifer. And they are big reservoirs of water. They contain most of that water, which we said is a part of groundwater. And they are recharged. Now they can be recharged laterally because that water flows like river from higher elevation to lower elevation as well. So just like the rivers are flowing, your groundwater is also flowing, or that aquifer is also flowing from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. And that's why people say that the groundwater here or in our regions is so pristine, because we naturally have that elevation which comes across the country from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, and it allows for our water to be drained into the sea as well as the groundwater to flow, and then for groundwater to be pristine and clean. Because if that groundwater isn't recharged quickly, if it doesn't move, then it's highly likely that if we consume it too much, it would just depress, or the water table would come down. And whether you are an economist or a scientist or biologist or computer scientist, whatever you are, you'll always have the discussion around groundwater table coming down, groundwater table going up. And that basically means that when the groundwater is recharging, that level could go up and down. In dry and wet seasons, that level could change. And of course, people say that when 10, 15 years ago, Lahore's water table was just 30 feet down, but now 30 meters down, but now it has gone like 40, 50 meters down as well. And that's because a lot of tube wells are being put in these places at the aquifers. And those tube wells extract that water. And although recharge is happening, that recharge may be renewable or fast, and it could be lateral or non-lateral, horizontal. But sometimes that recharge is slow as well. And sometimes it's so slow that you call it a non-renewable recharge of the aquifer. And that's why aquifer depletion is a very, very, very common phenomena in Earth. Yes, someone has raised their hand.
I have a question. This might seem a very silly question, but when we calculate, like when it rains and when we calculate कि कितनी बारिश हुई है, so do we calculate it from the surface water or the groundwater?
Yeah, so
Like from the aquifer or like the surface water?
So aquifer is deep, deep down under the ground. So I think it doesn't have a direct relation with rainwater, except for the fact that any rain that infiltrates does eventually become a part of the aquifer. Rainwater capturing is as simple as putting one of your mirroring cylinders outside when it rains, right? So if you have one of those mugs where you calculate how much milk you're drinking, if you just put that outside and it collects rainwater, basically that's been the oldest means of knowing how much rain is happening, right? So for that area, you would say that over 24 hours, this much rain happened. And now, of course, in the atmospheric, in the lecture where I will be teaching about atmosphere, I'll show you some of the old and new devices that calculate how much rain has happened, which is generally given in millimeters. And that's totally with reference to the surface level of the ground, not even water, just the surface ground level. And then how much water is accumulated in a certain body over a certain time, and then that's how you calculate it. But I will show you how that happens. But groundwater mostly is whatever is infiltrating, because how much infiltrates and then how much, because if your unsaturated zone becomes saturated, and then water cannot go down anymore unless it goes down and makes space, then that water is meant to surface flow. Okay, I mean, if you have more questions, you can leave them for later, but it's not that big question. It's like very simple. And I'm sure that when I show you a weather station, you will be able to see how certain things are calculated in it, which includes the speed of the weather as well as how much rain is being collected. Right, so we said that there's groundwater reservoirs and then there's surface water reservoirs. And the surface water reservoirs are, of course, like we said, when it rains, generally when the snow or the glacier ice melts, and all that water that's flowing in is a part of your surface water. And that's why surface runoff is an important part of it, because if there will only be very little water and it will infiltrate into the ground and it will not flow onto the surface, it will not be surface water, right? So anything that's running off the surface is called the surface water. And a lot of these drains, a lot of these small streams, a lot of these small rivers, when they come in and combine into one major water reservoir, that entire area is called either a drainage basin or a watershed. And we will see, like, watershed also has its own knowledge in terms of environmental sciences that we need to know. But right now, what you need to know is that these are our two major reservoirs, and between these two reservoirs, how they flow and the entire area where they are collecting this reservoir. For example, this picture that I've shared is of Indus River and the Indus drainage basin or Indus Basin. It basically shows that how many smaller rivers and streams are feeding into it to make it the mighty Indus. And then this one also is a very basic concept, but I think we need to, again, some of the things you need to remind yourself again and again is how water is being recycled into it. We said, yes, there is very limited water for us, but that water which is in unusable form in the oceans, or that water which is lying somewhere far away from us, can be made available to us when it rains. The water can be purified, it can be cleaned, it can be recycled, and it can become a part of this complex system, which is actually also one of the simplest forms of science that are taught to children. And it's the water cycle, that you have evaporation happening on the surface, transpiration happening in plants, and then that water is going up, it's condensing, it's traveling, clouds are forming, and then it's coming back in the form of rains. It's, again, this one is more related to the biosphere, but I just thought because we hadn't discussed it previously, it would be good to discuss it here. There's a lot that can be taught in here as well, but I basically wanted you to have a look at how life is divided between all of this, but also for you to think that something's missing here, something that we just discussed. And can anyone guess why groundwater is not a part of the aquatic biomes? Because it is one of the biggest reservoirs of water. Right. If no one is ready, then I can just tell you. And that is that generally groundwater does not have life forms. A lot of life forms is contained in the marine. Marine has its own life, like it has its own forest, it has its own biodiversity. And some people say that only less than 10% of life, or less than 10% of the life under ocean has been discovered, or ocean in general has been discovered. So you can imagine how diverse that part is. It's like a different area altogether. But freshwater, which we generally refer to as lakes, rivers, or swamps, they have certain life, and they are in general a part of hydrosphere, but the life in it is a part of the biosphere that we discussed last time. And we won't be discussing marine and estuaries in details, but estuaries is like at it stands between the freshwater and the marine waters. And I had difficulty in deciding exactly what should I teach you and what should I not teach you in this particular area, especially with reference to biomes, because freshwater ecology was an entire course that I had taken. But I think because we're talking about hydrosphere, and because we're talking about natural environments, and because we're talking about that natural capital that we mentioned in the beginning, which indirectly is benefiting us, which is giving us a service that we do not deserve, but we get that service for free without even asking for it. And because lakes have been one of the biggest reservoirs, when we saw the distribution of water on Earth, we saw that lakes make a big percentage of it. Within lakes, like there is another ecosystem that needs to be looked at. And I think because we could not discuss it in the biosphere, it's just for you to understand that life in that small, simple lake could be completely different from any other water resource, or even many other lakes that are around it, depending on how much light penetrates through it, depending on how oxygenated it is, depending on how much litter is coming from outside. And by litter, I also mean plants and plant debris that's coming from the other areas into the lake. And that basically divides into littoral, limnetic, and other zones. Benthic is where life doesn't really exist, it's super dark. And then limnetic is where light is present. The terms phytoplankton and zooplankton, maybe those who've studied biology would know it better, but they're basically plant-like and animal-like organisms, mostly unicellular or single cellular. Phytoplanktons produce their own food, and they provide the food to the higher life forms in the food chain within that lake, and so do zooplanktons. And then there are some zooplanktons are autotrophic, but most of them are heterotrophic, so they would be found in the other zone. And then within this, the temperature changes with depth, the light penetration changes with depth, life form changes with depth, and there's like an entire ecosystem there that of course we cannot go into, but I thought it would be good for you to have an idea, especially if, for example, some of you decide to study a lake or a water body. You should know that every water body would have its own water speed, or the currents in there would be different, and the life forms in there would be different based on what the salinity is, what's the pH, and what's the color, what's the order. It would always give you a different input about what you're looking at. And the only thing that I wanted to mention here before we move ahead, because we are mostly looking at the human intervention or human influence on this, is the fact that the lakes are more vulnerable to pollution compared to the rivers. And we will see why rivers are less prone to the pollution in one of the future slides. And I've shared the first reading here. I will not get into the details, but that first reading will kind of give you an analysis of what's happening in Pakistan. We say Pakistan's become one of the water scarce countries because it's per person annual water supplies close to 1,000 cubic meter per person, or between, but like very less than that. And when Pakistan became independent, we had plenty of water, but it's going down. And there are a lot of other theories with it, but because we're not looking at pollution and those things, we will look at them later. So today I will not discuss it in detail, but it's just because the discussion on water scarcity happens very often, and sometimes people don't know exactly what it means and exactly what the per capita water availability should be. So I thought it would be wise to just put a slide out there for you. And because I'm asking you to go back and read the article on where Pakistan stands in terms of water reservoirs, I still picked up a few points and that I thought your multidisciplinary class could benefit from. The first is that Pakistan utilizes between 92 to 95% of its water in agriculture sector. And unfortunately, our productivity is very low compared to, for example, here it is being compared with India and China, but our productivity is very low despite extensive water use in there. And it impacts our GDP. It's been compared to Egypt. And it also says that there's a lot of willingness and political determination, as well as economic and technological intervention that is required for people to make that change. But one thing, whether you speak about Pakistan or the United States of America or Saudi Arabia, The one sentence that would be common everywhere in terms of especially groundwater is that it's being withdrawn at a faster rate than it can be replenished. And for example, I've put a figure again from those news articles that we had only 20,000 tube wells then, and now we have more than 1 million tube wells that are extracting groundwater, and there was no act for it until recently. And then we need environmental flows. There is a little flow that we need, and I think you could relate it to the Indus dolphin case study that we studied, because we said its habitat had been damaged. So I think you can go back and look at that, of why environmental flows are important for biodiversity and ecology. And every big presentation generally gives you a map like this. And there's no particular reason to share this one, but only an observation that no matter which graph or which map people put on, Pakistan's always showing high risk. Pakistan's always at the worst side of it. For example, here they're saying the overall water risk for certain countries, and many other countries are suffering from water risk or have high water risk as well. But if you look at Pakistan as a whole, even, for example, the places where all the glacial ice remains, and that's also a low to medium risk area, and not a low risk area or no risk area, kind of. And because a lot of serious discussions happened, I just thought maybe we can take a break here and talk about Aral Sea, which is a lake in Central Asia. And it was shrinking with time. And the reason for it to shrink was that, like us, they wanted better agriculture, more crop production, more food security in their region. And that's why they redirected their natural capital, or most of their rivers, for irrigation. And it resulted in degradation of the lake that was being charged or recharged with the help of those two rivers, which is called Sira Darya and Amu Darya. And because they were redirected, it resulted in the lake shrinking, or the Aral Sea shrinking with time. And so much so that a lot of money is now being invested into just getting this back to its original health. The salinity has increased, the biodiversity was impacted, the fisheries communities was impacted. And like I said, it's always not just the environmental consequences, it's the human side of it as well that we see when we study environmental sciences. And not just that, like, because a lot of herbicides were used, pesticides were used, the human health was compromised on, and a lot of people got sick, their health was damaged, health of the biodiversity was damaged. So there were multiple layers of impacts that this single project of better productivity or improved agriculture created in this region. And with this, I wanted to redirect you to webinar that we did, or a panel discussion that we did from the WIT platform with the Irrigation Minister of Punjab, Mr. Mohsin Saab. Because if you know, Punjab also after partition made a lot of link canals to divert water from rivers that were given to us to the rivers that were now dry because their custody was given to India. So you don't need to listen to all of it, but that extract where the ministers talking about how it's being managed, and in case of Punjab or Pakistan at least, it has been a successful case. So while I showed you a relatively unsuccessful case, I thought maybe you can have a look at how Punjab's doing it really well, and still is the food basket of the country. And again, like this discussion also needed to come in at some point in the water reservoir discussion here, especially when we were talking about natural reservoir. We are talking about human intervention into it as well. And I think there are a lot of discussions that happen around dams, and environmentalists are always very confused on where to stand, because it has both advantages and disadvantages. The energy that comes out of it is relatively clean, but the compromise on maybe the life below water, and the compromise on the plants and the biodiversity that existed in that area before, or even any indigenous culture or heritage that was in that area. That trade-off, I think, is something that that we generally think a lot about. But you know that then you don't know which stance to take. But I think whatever stance you take, you should understand why you're standing where you're standing. So if people need electricity, if people need water reservoirs for flood control, for example, Pakistan recently has been facing a lot of floods, and a lot of people say it's because of the fact that we have compromised on the watershed in general and the drainage basin in general, but mostly we haven't built any storage reservoirs. So and again, the irrigation and the diversion that we were talking about, you will have to make that decision as, and of course as economists you will look at it with a more complicated way. But for people who are studying history, or for people who would be studying anthropology or sociology, when they discuss it, like, who do you go to? Do you go to the decision maker and think that right now this is the need of the hour, or do you go to people and ask them exactly what they need? Or is the displacement worth it, and what are the options, and what are the scientific failures that can be caused, not just human failures but also scientific failures that can be caused as a result of it. They're fairly simple points. I think you can go through them yourself later. The other things, because we're talking about water supply, and we talked about groundwater as the biggest reservoir, and then surface water, which is passing by us, and we like to use it as much as we want. A technology that has recently emerged and is relatively close to my heart because I've seen it operate is desalination. And that's because we said a lot of the water that's present on Earth is in an unusable form or has a lot of salinity. This technology basically is a fine membrane, or let's say just a fine filter, which allows only water molecules to pass through. And they are generally done by filtration. So reverse osmosis is a technology where filtration is used. So very small pore sizes, smaller than nanoscales, are used to filter water and get the brine, which is rich, salty seawater, out, and only clean water out of the filtration setup. And similarly, distillation is another way where you kind of heat the water, allow water vapors to be captured, condensed, very similar to the water cycle. It's slightly warm, water vapors are formed. Water vapors are formed at room temperature as well. So it's not that you only need to increase the temperature. If you leave a cup in your room, over a period of days, that cup would be empty. And that's because water vapors are being formed. Maybe not at a rate at which water vapors would be formed at high temperature, but they're always formed. So those water vapors condense somewhere, and then that is clean, and that can be captured and used for drinking. And again, these technologies have disadvantages and advantages, both environmental and economic. And if you have any queries, you can come back to me later on this as well. But then reclamation is the concept that I think I enjoy the most. And every time I think of reclamation, because it is my area of research as well, I cannot ignore or not think of Singapore. And the reason for that is that Singapore is rich enough. It has that population, that kind of affluence where it can afford reverse osmosis. But they decided to use wastewater and convert it into clean water using filtration mechanisms. And that water was called New Water. And it's very famous. Wherever you go, people, at least Singaporeans, take pride in the fact that you're using New Water, because even wastewater is often 99.9% water. So if you get rid of the bugs, if you get rid of everything else, it's basically water. And what they do is they use, so like I said, reverse osmosis is energy intensive. And if you're using seawater, then because it has small salt molecules, it can clog the filtration process very quickly. So what they do here is they use a relatively lesser filtration sheet. So for example, microfiltration or ultrafiltration, which goes in the micro range. Filter it with that first, the wastewater, then take it to a reverse osmosis, because now it's mostly clean water already. And then after that, disinfect it and give it to public for use. And Singaporeans are drinking it. The yuck factor, which is generally, again, people who want to study behavior or how people would be willing to drink this water, can think about that later. But generally, for example, I looked at a study in Australia where people were saying, we know it's 100% water, we know it's clean, we know it's been disinfected, but we don't want to drink it. Just thinking that it's coming from wastewater, we don't want to drink it. But because Singaporeans gave it that new water name, as well as there was a political will to do it, everyone, there was a will from the citizen to accept it. They were then able to get clean water from wastewater, and it's being used in the city for quite a while now. And they are saying that it's because of the brine that I was talking about in reverse osmosis, which goes back to the ocean, is an environmental problem for the ocean. So when we use seawater, when we desalinate it, that concentrated salt that generally goes back to the ocean is also an environmental nuisance. So that's why I think they chose this, and they are happy with the way that it's working. Yes.
So basically, I have a question regarding reverse osmosis.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I, so basically, the main concern that I have is that reverse osmosis basically can also remove minerals from the water, leaving it at like an acidic pH. So don't it's a big disadvantage for us
Yeah, I
as a
mean,
human.
exactly. So because that's what you want, right? The concept is for us to get water molecules only, which you will see in the slide that I've just shared. And I've specially edited the slide for you, Azan, because when I say that microfiltration, ultrafiltration, nanofiltration, and then reverse osmosis comes at the end, it means that ideally this technology will only allow water molecules to pass through it. Now, adding nutrients is not a difficulty. That's exactly what these bottled water companies are doing, right? They are using reverse osmosis to clean the tap water or to clean the underground water, and then they are adding nutrients and minerals back into it. So sometimes people call it mineral water based on how many minerals they have added in it, or sometimes they just add whatever is the basic drinking water quality requirement, and then bottle it and sell it to you. So I think it's more or less the same. And because the idea is to get clean drinking water and reject everything else, that's why reverse osmosis is most suitable. It is expensive. I don't think countries like us can afford to run it sustainably, at least. But for example, Saudi Arabia is getting more than 50% of its drinking water from reverse osmosis or from desalination. So there are countries, they're doing it and are benefiting from it. This is a slightly, I know it's a very populated slide, but I spent a lot of time trying to design it. And the reason for that was because if we are going to talk about human influence on water bodies, we need to talk about pollutants. We need to talk about exactly what we mean when we say that the water is polluted, and what could those pollutants do to the water body. And generally, like the pollution that's coming in water can be point or non-point. So for example, the drainage basin that we saw in the beginning, if for example in somewhere in Hunza a pollutant is being, let's say an expired medicine kit is discarded into it, and then it comes down and impacts someone in Gilgit, and it can be traced back to that one point, it would be a point source of pollution, kind of. But let's say if there are multiple polluters, there's a factory somewhere that's also doing the same, there is an individual household household that's also doing the same, or the waste from the municipalities that's being dumped into it is also doing the same, then it's difficult to trace it back to the one source that could be causing it. Like, it's not one factory, it's not one person. Then it becomes a non-point source of pollution. It's easy to trace the point sources of pollution. It's easy to put a regulation and watch on that compared to the non-point source. And of course, the non-point sources would require a lot of capital only to be identified where this is coming from. And by the way, pollutants do not always come from artificial sources. Natural sources can also be pollutants. So for example, when I say sediments are pollutants, it's just soil and silt. that is coming from your watershed or from that drainage basin, and or from land erosion. And what it's doing is that it's not allowing water molecules, the sun to pass through, and photosynthesis to occur, and the food webs being compromised. So pollutants can be of many types. And similarly, heat is a pollution, right? So when factories, industries use water for cooling, and then that warm water is sent to a water body nearby, then the life in that water body is impacted. So there are multiple forms of those pollutants. Pathogens, we all know, because recently there's a lot of discussion on pathogens. So I think you can just get that. It comes from our waste, it comes from pathogenic waste from hospitals, etc. And it's not good for our health. But chemicals that are coming out of factories, of the chemicals that we use at household daily, or certain products that we use, they can be organic and inorganic in nature, and they can simply make the water toxic. So for example, if it's an acid that you're using to clean your drains, and it's ending up in one of the streams nearby because you don't have a proper wastewater disposal system, then that acidity could add more toxicity into the water, because acids then leach, other chemicals, or acids can then do many other damages, which I'm sure the chemists would understand more. But just for you to understand that these organic and inorganic chemicals, when they go to the water bodies, and they could go from multiple sources, not just industries. And somewhere, I think, because the reading that I'm sharing, which is my own internship report, I am discussing the biological oxygen demand and chemical oxygen demand in it. So I think that I would like to explain here, and then maybe we can move forward. So I say that some pollutants, in one of the boxes, I've said that some pollutants are oxygen demanding. And oxygen demanding, I mean that they require oxygen to degrade, and that oxygen requirement can be chemical, or that oxygen requirement can be biological. When it is biological, for example, if a bacteria needs oxygen to degrade a particular chemical or a particular organic molecule, then it would be biological oxygen demand. But if a particular chemical, for example, potassium dichromate that's coming out of my toilet, goes there, and then that requires oxygen to degrade, that requirement would be chemical oxygen demand. And the report that I've shared with you, when you read it, don't worry too much about getting it exactly right. Just understand the concept, because I've shared numbers with you. And we can discuss it in the next class. And I really want to discuss it in the next class, because I wanted to discuss cleaning of wastewater in this lecture. But I think that would have been too much, because I've already put a lot of random information on here. Similarly, heavy metals, the pollution type, the impacts. I've given some examples in every box. And then I've also told you what are the sources for those. And like I said, plant nutrients, which could come in the form of fertilizers, which is the fertilizers that we buy from outside, or generally plant debris. All of them can be a pollutant in the water body that we are discussing. And here, I think, when I discussed a lake, I also wanted to discuss a flowing water body. And I told you that a lake would be more vulnerable compared to a water body that's flowing, right? So let's say this is a water body, let's say this is a small stream or a river, then we know that there's a point source of pollution. Let's say this point source is a textile industry. And not only is it sending a lot of colors, but also a lot of toxicants into this water body. And in the beginning, the dissolved oxygen is high, the life in the water is happy, healthy, and the biological oxygen demand is less. Because there's less waste, the smaller life forms require less oxygen to degrade it. And oxygen in general, the dissolved oxygen is already so high, so they're all right, they're happy, whatever, because they already have a lot of oxygen. Suddenly, this pollution comes in, and then now you require, no, the oxygen is compromised all, because now you require oxygen to take care of that chemical. And you also require oxygen to degrade any life forms that's present in there. So to degrade the chemicals biologically and chemically, you would need oxygen. But now you don't have enough, because that mixing is being compromised on, light is not passing through, and that environment has changed, which has resulted for this zone to become a decomposition zone, where life is now dying. And for example, bacteria would require oxygen to degrade the dead fish body, or the body of a dead zooplankton or phytoplankton. And when oxygen goes completely absent, so when there is very little or no oxygen in it, so for example, here we have said that 8 ppm is our mark of dissolved oxygen in a healthy water body. It's going down to, let's say, less than 1 ppm, or less than 1 milligram per liter of oxygen. And then because it's diluting itself, because it's flowing, eventually you see that towards the end, life is getting back to normal. So it's from a clean zone, it's going back to the clean zone because it gets the time for recovery. I hope that you were able to understand that. But then the next concept that I think is very common in environmental scientists is we always discuss eutrophication. We discuss eutrophication because it comes from natural and non-natural resources. And those nitrates and phosphates that are in excess because of sewage, because of inorganic fertilizers, because of plant debris, eventually allows for algae to grow on a water body. Mostly it's lakes. And that then results in the destruction of life form under it, because now light cannot pass through. And because light cannot pass through, just think of the slide that we saw in freshwater ecosystem. If light doesn't pass through, then the life that was in the limnatic zone, which could create its own food, or the phytoplanktons, they will die. And then the zooplanktons would die because they were feeding on it. And then eventually the fish will die because there will not be enough oxygen. There will not be the food that they need to strive in it. And that's why it would be a problem. So a lake that is not eutrophic is generally called oligotrophic. And I will not be going into detail in the ocean or marine life or marine biome. But I think, again, this is also something that every environmental scientist that I know knows. And that's the Exxon Valdez oil spill that happened because of this cruise that was carrying crude oil. When it hit a reef, then 11 million gallons of crude oil was discharged into this water body. And I think the impact that it created was huge. And because it was away from help, the life form that suffered because of it was really high, and approximately 1,500 miles of shoreline was affected. Life, I've highlighted the numbers, done the numbers in bold, put the numbers in bold. You would see that the numbers are high, and this is just instant impacts. Life form that was flying or passing by it and died elsewhere, or was feeding on it and died elsewhere. That's I don't think that's accounted in here, but it was a huge economic loss. Again, the fishermen were impacted. Biodiversity was clearly impacted, and the ecology or wildlife system was completely destroyed. And that's why I think we need to be careful in this. The only thing before I bring, let me see what else I, because I want to bring Dr. Mahmood in, who wanted to explain the tragedy of the commons to you with the help of groundwater problem in Pakistan. But before that, I would just like to say that, like I said, groundwater does not have life, and groundwater is not put in, groundwater is not put in the biome section because it doesn't have life. That also means that when it is polluted, it makes it difficult to remediate it, because there's no oxygen, there's no light. All of those forms that are present on the surface to take care of pollution are not there. And life is not there. Microorganisms are not there. So every time there is a pollutant leaks into groundwater, they try to contain it. And those who are doing biology and chemistry a major, I would really recommend them to go and see how groundwater pollution is controlled. So they try to control it in one place, then they inject sorbents, adsorbents, chemicals, microorganisms, and in that case, there would be anaerobic microorganisms or microorganisms that could survive without light. And it becomes a big nuisance. And that's why sometimes I'm very skeptical about the idea of recharging the groundwater, because I think it's such a pristine resource, but also if one pollutant leaks into it, then you don't know the travel path of it. And because eventually, and also because if you clean the groundwater and recharge the groundwater, you're going to extract it and bring it back to the surface and use it, then why mess with such a big reservoir that is available to us in such clean and pure form? So just that, and maybe I can allow Dr. Mahmood to come in and explain the tragedy of the commons to you in 10 minutes, and maybe then we can go to the conclusions.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Should I put on the video so at least to be more?
It's up
Let's
to you,
see.
Dr. Mahmood.
Okay. Yes, I think I'm enjoying your lectures, Fawzia, and I also look forward for a standalone lecture later in your course. But it was very intriguing on when you were talking in last lecture on tragedy of common. But before that, I think I can't let it go like this, because today you mentioned RLC, yeah?
Yeah.
Since I was part, I think that to me that's a bigger tragedy to narrate, and I was part of it in the sense that, of course, it is in Kazakhstan and a very complicated problem. So because this is something very interesting, and I think class might be of interest to them as well. I was given an assignment from FAO to really do some policy work in Kazakhstan. That was out of our Cairo office. And when I went there, and oh my God, the donors were sitting on somebody 30 million, 40 million. They were doing so much work. A lot of their work was concentrated on, ALC, how to save it. So I think we had very little money, like $15,000-$20,000 from FAO, and I thought, what the best I can do to use this money effectively so the country can benefit. So I looked around that what is happening to the water, how it is used over time. So I just really built a capacity of the Ministry of Agriculture, and some water ministry people were also there. And we went out and collected the data from the field on two crops, rice and cotton, but more focus on rice because that is the most water thirsty crop. And with little quietly work we were doing, and after 2-3 months we came up with results. And I can't forget this moment when I presented the case to the Vice Minister. I told them, what you are doing is that you are spending $4 to get really $1 back in growing rice. He said, are you crazy? I said, no, I have not included the environmental cost of ALC, what you have foregone. If I include that, probably it's lot more. So I think that triggered a complete, she said, why these donors are not telling me this? I said, because they don't collect the real data which is needed to analyze a problem. So what happened was essentially this Ammu and Sir Darya, the water was transferred to growing these cotton and rice belt it grew. So less and less water was flowing to the RLC, and the lake dried up. And one of the most thriving fishery society was really out of work, out of job, out of livelihood. And of course, the most famous fish, which was so famous outside, they also lost the market. So that was very interesting for me. Probably that was one of the best thing I did it with little money, we were able to showcase really. So it's good that you brought it today. That reminded me my old story, eh? Now coming back to the groundwater, I think to me, when we talk of common tragedy in this region, groundwater is the story, because we are not using it on a sustainable manner. In that sense, we are pumping more out than the recharge is. So I think, I mean, that area you have covered, but I think I will like to run few cases, successful cases, which it's very difficult. Very few countries are there who have brought this back to the sustainable levels. I think first one, I worked in Palestine also, and so I was able to also interact at that time. Palestine and Israel were in good terms. This is when they got their first treaty. And so I got also a lot of interaction from Israel side and what they are doing. So I was able to compare very much how they are managing their groundwater and how Palestine is managing groundwater. In Gaza and other places, the groundwater was going down so fast. It was just like our condition. But what I also was interested to know what's happening in Israel. This is what they told me. They told me that what happens is, if there is a community and if they monitor the groundwater, if it comes close to unsustainable level, they issue an alert warning. Then if that doesn't help, if it goes down, they just complete the whole system, shut it down. So it is so important to get it on sustainable level. So this is one case study. I wish I could get more data on it for writing a case study to compare it. But then I think I also visited Oman, and they are, I think, replicating somehow this, and they are also using these water alerts to the user that, okay, if the groundwater is approaching unsustainable level, something will come. I don't know what penalty they are putting on, but I think this is also something working on. But I think the most interesting case I have read, because I have a very strong interest in this, is a case in India, Andhra Pradesh, where what they have is called the community-based approach. Again, I think this is, I keep telling our people in the ministries, also our minister you alluded to, that I think we should try this case study. What they do is they let community in one of the areas where groundwater was fast depleting. They said, okay, government has failed completely, so let community make their own laws. Let them monitor how they are going to manage the groundwater back to sustainable levels. So I think that's a unique case. What happened was, they said that what is needed is, again, you highlighted that agriculture is using most of the water. So they immediately found out that, okay, there is no way they can grow crops which are using too much water. So that was their first really on the drawing board. They said, as a community, we have to decide which crops. So I think within a span of few years, they planned to really, on the one side, they monitor the community itself, the groundwater levels. On the other side, they were doing groundwork to readjust their cropping pattern. Only grow crops which were using less water. And I think within no time, probably the groundwater started recovering. And it is one of the most cited success story. Now, they had to change it to a cropping pattern which was a lot more adding value to their produce. So what they did, they were able to save water, they were able to reduce costs, they were able to really get more income from there. So they were able to raise their water productivity, in short. So I think these are few case studies. I have a lot of others from the region, because I worked good 24 years in a region where I can feel the water scarcity. A closing note, Pakistan has plenty of water, plenty of water. It is all mismanaged. And I think a lot of these numbers which we call it per capita reduction, it is because of our, population explosion. I think that explains the water is there. We are mismanaging it. Yeah, this is my brief note, and I will take up some of these really cases when I do the presentation on what we are doing right now, real time.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Mahmood. I hope that it helped the students. And of course, you come in with such like I have studied very little, and it's difficult for me to decide what to put on the slide and what not to. Until last minute, I'm saying, oh, it's such a shame I could not put that. So I'm sure for you,
No, you're doing fine.
it's very complicated to decide exactly what to talk about, because for 30 years, you've traveled this entire region and looked at things. This final slide is a conclusion which I've left sort of incomplete on purpose, because we have some time, and I want you guys to tell me, how do you think can we save water, conserve water, and make individual actions, personal actions, use them to improve it. And of course, I've put efficiency or agricultural, you can think of irrigation and agriculture area as well, because if that's where most of our water is going, then how can we be more efficient there? For example, the first thing that I can think of is Dr. Abu Bakr's soil moisture sensors. So if I'm a farmer, I would go and buy the soil moisture sensor, put it in my field, and only water my crops when the soil moisture tells me to water it. So I'm already saving water there. So that's like one thing, but I'm going to take points from or notes from you to populate the slide. And I think Fateh is the first one to raise his hand. So maybe he can tell me how can we save water, conserve water, keep our hydrosphere clean.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. So now I thought about this idea a few days ago when I was applying for Lum's Entrepreneurial Society for my startup options. So what I thought was, why don't we the support for agricultural research, specifically research into the development of seeds of a very of crops which require a lot of water, basically rice, cotton, and sugarcane. So now these um, uh, crops, they take up a lot of water during farming. So research into the constant development of new varieties of seeds that can produce just as much at less water cost. So that's an idea I have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fateh. I mean, I value these because they're coming from a person who's studying history, right? So I think it's a very relevant point. Some seeds, and I think we discussed this last time as well, that how genetic engineering is now making genetic engineers produce seeds that could use less water, or produce combinations that could be water efficient and its productivity could be higher. So all of those things. Fateh, Hassan, you had raised your hand. I'm also populating the slide with my own head as well as the comments that are coming from you. Ali, do you want to?
I raised my hand really far back, but I think that point is already crossed now. So I was basically asking about groundwater and how it's not possible for them to have microorganisms, because wouldn't that also include it in the biosphere?
Yeah, so microorganisms. So, like I said, groundwater does not have a biota of its or a life of its own, unless we've introduced it there, unless we have on purpose put it there. But if life exists, so any life that exists in any sphere, whether that's hydrosphere or atmosphere, is a part of biosphere. And that's why these spheres are interlinked. So wherever there's life, that area is biosphere. Yes, Ali.
The first thing that comes to my mind when I think of saving water at an individual level, I feel like it's more about reducing your meat consumption. Because even if you cannot go vegan, a vegan on average consumes 600 gallons of water less than an average American per day, which is like a big amount of water. No matter how much water you save on an individual level by turning off your tap or whatever you do, that's like a big amount of water. And even if you can't go vegan or something, if you can just reduce the amount of meat that you consume, you can make a big impact.
Right. Right. So I think some of you would remember the productivity and energy transfer discussion. Could understand. For example, in our college, there was this entire debate at Jesus about doing meatless Mondays. So no one's asking you to stop eating meat, but we're asking you to just eat meat to meet your protein requirements, not to have an extra dish on the table. So it's not directly linked to your comment, but I think I wanted to make a reference to the previous slide and how energy is being transported into the trophic levels and how one food choice could be more beneficial to the environment compared to another food choice. Atka.
I think that in under agriculture, I think that we can use sprayers instead of like immersion methods to water crops, which will actually save a lot of water. And secondly, like I read somewhere about water metering, that when the amount of water that you use, it can be calculated and it can be monitored. So and it can also help you detect leaks, and maybe the government can monitor it in some way. So I think that both of these things can also be used.
Yeah, so water supply is like a whole different sector that we did not discuss here, which is the fact that every Pakistani thinks that they have a right to every drop of water that's coming to their house. If imagine, so at least the case study that I've shared with you tells you that only 30 to 40 liters of water per person was provided to that refugee shed, which meant that they only had that much water. So it was supply driven. They were given a certain amount of water and they were asked to manage it. Whereas in Pakistan, we just turn our tap on and we say that until I sleep, there should be water in this tap. So when it's that, I think that's also a decision. And you would see that even though we are discussing science and environmental sciences, when it comes to efficiency, there are more discussions on technology, there's more discussion on taxation, there's more discussion on pricing, there's more discussion on regulation and enforcing those regulations. And that is why I like this field, because I have the liberty to go outside of science and say, yes, this is what's happening, this is how it can be controlled, but now what? And that's where all of your roles come in. Um, role of an English writer in creating awareness about this at a massive scale. The role of an economist in changing behavior or in studying behavioral changes. So all of that. We have very little time left. Who can I take next? Daniel, do you want to talk?
No, I had a suggestion that we can use rainwater by storing it in tanks at our home, for example, and we can use it for things like watering plants or washing clothes, rather than using tap water for that.
Yeah, so the fresh water that we use a lot, people say that gray water, which I think if I bring in the WWF people, they could share some case studies where they're using gray water from mosques, or the wudu water from mosques, and they're using it back in watering the field that is associated to the mosque, and this is happening right in the heart of Lahore. A lot of universities have now installed rainwater harvesting tanks. So grey water reuse on site and rainwater harvesting and its use on site have become a common practice in most areas. So I'm just putting it there in the slide. Hadi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the ways we can conserve water is to alter our outdated irrigation systems, and one of the main ways through which water is lost is through seepage in canals and evaporation as well. So by lining canals with trees, you can not only prevent evaporation, but by lining canals, you with impermeable substances like cement, plastic, concrete. Like these are some of the types you can reduce water shortages through that.
So thank you for bringing this up, because again, this is open to negotiation. If you line it, you stop the groundwater recharge as well. So depending on that area being a groundwater intensive area or less intensive area, you can propose lining the canal. Depending on the water cycle and its dependency on those water bodies, you can say that we either cover it or we use, for example, solar panels to cover it, so that not only do they capture the solar light, but also they cover the water body. And the same goes for canopy or crops to cover it. But yeah, these are ideas that people put depending on where they are. Just understand that you might be talking about one area and one need, and that it may not fit everybody. Hamad.
Ma'am, I think tunnel forming can be one of the ways in which we can save water, as it uses less water as compared to usual farming.
So can you tell
So,
people who don't know what tunnel farming is, what tunnel farming is?
so basically what I know is that you dug tunnels and then you grow in a certain area, certain crops, not not like many, but there are certain crops that can be grown in tunnels. So that's what tunnel farming is, and it uses less water, I think, as compared to
Kind of cover,
usual farming.
you kind of,
Yeah, exactly.
okay.
Exactly.
It is one of
Thank
the
you.
water conservation strategies in agriculture. Tunnel farming. Hadi.
No, sorry, my hand was up. I don't have to
Okay.
add anything.
Adeem.
Yes, ma'am. I had a question regarding the soil moisture sensors that aren't the crops have a specific time on which they need to be like made in which the water made should be available for them, and like if it is not available for them at that time, it might affect the quality of the crop which is produced. I
So
guess.
let me quickly check if Dr. Bakar is with us today, because I would really like to use his expertise. Yes, he is. So I am passing this question to Dr. Bakar.
So Fauzi, I'm so sorry, मैं थोड़ा सा I wasn't paying attention. थोड़ा जल्दी से repeat कर देंगे?
जी सब आपसे पूछना चाह रहे हैं कि different crops have different water requirements, so how does the soil moisture fit all kinds of environments and all kinds of crops, and if it how precise it is, and does that affect the growth of the crop?
Okay, all right. So I mean the technology is sort of independent of irrigation method and the crop type, because I mean the methodology is that we only sense what is the amount of moisture in the soil. So the crop essentially sucks water from the soil and basically transpires, and that actually depletes the moisture level. So we are just measuring how much of that moisture is being depleted, and as soon as this moisture either falls below a certain maximum level or above a certain minimum level, we know that we are doing all right. And if we just go out of bounds, then we just send an alert to the farmer. So the sensor does not know what are you growing. As long as you are within the required range, it works absolutely fine.
Right. Yeah. So I think you got the answer. It's the fact that its connection is just with the soil that any plant is utilizing, whether it's water intensive or less water intensive. So if the soil water moisture changes, it tells its user that it's now time to water it. And that would of course change quickly based on what kind of crop you're growing. Hamza, I'll take
may I add maybe another point here?
Please.
So those of you who are interested in technology, there is an alternate way of looking at the soil moisture from the satellite. Okay, and there you need to know what crop type is there, because it indirectly measures soil moisture by inferring how much the crop would have been consuming. In this technology that we are using, this is independent of that. So I mean that's the difference there.
Right. Great. Okay, so I had a slide for bottled water use and its health and environmental risks, but I would skip that. And I will take Hamza's comment quickly, and then I think I'll just go towards ending the lecture. Yes, Hamza.
Yes, ma'am. Like I wanted to comment, a lot of water is wasted in textile industry, and they produce huge volumes of textile because of the high demand and because of our shopping practices. Like we buy a new pair of jeans and new pair of t-shirts every month or almost every week. So if we somehow change that trend of buying new clothes like every week or every month, so we can save water. Fast fashion, yeah, exactly. That's the term I was looking for.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly where it started from when we were young, turning off the taps to reduce water consumption while we are brushing our teeth, etc. On to then, and that's why I think I quoted the water footprint and how much water is actually being used virtually when you are into fast fashion. And textile industries, we know, are there are many textile industries in Pakistan and they're heavily polluting our water bodies. So always ask yourself before shopping whether you need that thing or not. I'll just quickly share, I mean, the home task, you don't have to worry about other things. I'm now changing the research task to seeing how you're treating the clean drinking water in your house, whether you're getting bottled water, whether you have a filter at home, what kind of filter do you think it is, because it has 3 components, right? You should know what's the filtration size of that filter, whether it's ultrafiltration or whether it's reverse osmosis, and also what kind of disinfection are you using, and have you ever tested the water quality in your area, etc., etc. And then on LMS, I've uploaded 3 readings. One is for everyone, which is my internship report with UNICEF in Jordan, which I think has the human and environmental component to it. Some of it might be complicated for you, but just try, if you're a social sciences student, just try and understand most of it, and we can discuss it in the class next time. The other 2 are for people maybe who want to study more. They're again my own research papers on membrane bioreactors for wastewater treatment, as well as forward osmosis and then different kind of filtrations. So either using nanofiltration membranes or forward osmosis membranes for forward osmosis. So again, they're more technical for people to see. The other readings that I've uploaded from place to place, please read it. I think the most relevant one would be the situational analysis of water in Pakistan. And I've added some additional slides because we could not talk about natural disasters or disasters that are happening because of human activities. I've put some social side of slides on floods and urban flooding, not scientific at all. Just how does the government plan on taking care of urban flooding? And because we experience it every year, I thought it's from another lecture that I gave, but I thought as an additional reading, I could just place it there so that if you're interested, you could go through it. And I think that is it from my side, unless you have any questions. I will populate this conclusion slide a little bit more before I upload it on the LMS, but the readings are there. So if you don't have any questions, I think we can.
Ma'am, I have a question. Ma'am, I do not have access to the course tab on LMS yet.
Oh, Hamza, you just added, right?
Yeah.
So I will remember this and email you all the details.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
You don't have access to all the other lectures?
Yes, not yet.
Because I'm waiting for everyone to submit their work, which means maybe I can just share the slides with you on via email, and then the rest of it we can figure it out later. But how was the class for you? Was it all right?
Yes, ma'am, it was very informative.
Okay, super. I just need to populate the conclusion slide and then upload it on LMS and send it to Hamza, remind myself to send it to you. And if you don't have any question, thank you very much for joining, Dr. Mahmood and Dr. Abu Bakr, for coming and listening to me, but also contributing and helping my students. And you're free to leave. Adine, do you have a query?
Yes, ma'am. I had a question regarding that